Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. It's so lovely to have you tonight for our virtual program, the CAAM and Asian Art Museum Partnership Collaboration Program. Before we begin, I wanted to acknowledge, first of all, my name is Indra Mungal. I work at the Asian Art Museum, and the Asian Art Museum acknowledges that we are located on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants and indigenous stewards of the San Francisco Peninsula. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. Tonight, the Asian Art Museum is particularly excited about this program because we're welcoming back chef and cookbook author Diep Tran after she did a fantastic program for us in November with Soleil Ho. If you're interested in seeing that program, please check out our YouTube site. Diep is joined by rice farmer Robin Koda and wheat farmer Mai Nguyen for a conversation about the complex role of rice in the formation of Asian Americana. In popular culture, rice plays many roles, from a crop that symbolizes the ingenuity, thrift, and resilience of Asian American farmers to a food that represents Asian American cuisine as a whole. In this event, co-presented by CAAM, we'll explore the many narratives of rice and consider if these stories expand or narrow our understanding of Asian American culture. I'd also like to note that having two Asian American women farmers is extraordinary. The US Census of Agriculture shows that Asian Americans made up less than 1% of the 2017 farming population in this country. These numbers stand in stark contrast to the 19th and early 20th century, when Asian American farmers were ubiquitous. And I can imagine that the percentage of women farmers and Asian American women farmers in particular must be minuscule, but thankfully growing. And especially if we all support their efforts by choosing their products when we purchase rice and wheat. During the program, we will post links where to purchase their products. So hope you'll check out the stores that sell their products. So I'm really pleased and honored to introduce Tweedy Tran, who is CAAM's current festival and exhibitions director. This is her inaugural year and she's doing a phenomenal job. In the past, Tweedy was an associate producer of the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco and has also worked with us at the Asian Art Museum as our contemporary art curatorial fellow, developing global art dialogues. Tweedy founded the Roots Recipes Project in 2018 to reflect on the ways that food has played a role in AAPI identity and resistance through meal gatherings and workshops. So without further ado, please, Tweedy, welcome.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Rice and Asian Americana. Thank you, Indra, for your leadership in organizing this fantastic program, and thank you to the Asian Art Museum for being such a great community partner and friend to CAAM. Again, my name is Tweedy, my pronouns are she, they, and I'm the Festival and Exhibitions Director of CAAM. Celebrating our 40th anniversary this year, CAAMFest is one of the world's leading showcase for Asian and Asian American talent in film, food, and music. This will be our last weekend, so please check out caamfest.com for more information on our programs at the SF MoMA tomorrow and Saturday, as well as the New Parkway Theater in Oakland on Sunday. This Saturday at 12:30 p.m., we have a free outdoor music concert in partnership with the Yerba Buena Gardens Festival called Panay's on the Rise, featuring up-and-coming artists. So I was stoked when Indra told me about who our panelists are. I'm such a fangirl of all of our speakers, and I'm very much looking forward to tonight's conversation. Rice and grains is such a central aspect of our Asian foodways and culture. In Vietnam, a common greeting we have is "Ăn cơm chưa?" The literal translation is "Have you eaten rice yet?" And the colloquial meaning, "Have you eaten?" Our food, our language, our culture, embedded in these tiny little grains, has been carried overseas and rooted into the soil of this adopted land. Our brilliant farmers, Robin and Mai, will share more about their history, agricultural knowledge, and insights into land justice. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator. So Diep Tran comes from a family of restaurateurs and chefs. She has been a longtime advocate for workers' rights in the restaurant industry. She is the founder of the Banh Chung Collective, an annual queer-centric celebration of the Lunar New Year. Currently, she is the R&D chef for Red Boat Fish Sauce, and most recently co-authored the Red Boat Fish Sauce Cookbook, one of NPR's 2021 books we love. She has been featured in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Lucky Peach, Saveur, the Netflix series Ugly Delicious, KCET's Migrant Kitchen, and HBOMax's Takeout with Lisa Ling. All right, Diep, I'm gonna let you take it away.
Hi, thanks so much, Tweedy. Happy AAPI month, everybody. I am so excited to have this joint event with Asian Art Museum and Center for Asian American Media, fans of both. Really happy to be back. And you know, I was struck when we were done with the event I did in, I think in November or something. Indira's driving me back to the hotel. She goes, "You want to do an event?" And I'm like, "Oh, what kind of food event would I want to do?" And I immediately thought of two folks, you know, who we have invited here, Mai Nguyen and Robin Koda. And so super just honored that they said yes. And so hi Robin, hi Mai, you can show yourselves now. To give you a little insight on both Mai and Robert, I'm going to embarrass them by reading their bios. Okay, so so Robin Koda grew up on the family farm, Koda Farm, walking through paddy levees to find birds' nests and catch crayfish. Today, as the co-owner and operator of the oldest rice farm and mill in California, she often shares the nuances and richly storied history of rice, rooted in familial ties. Oh God, I'm gonna butcher this. Saburo Koda, Robin's grandfather, immigrated from Japan in 1908 and earned the acclaim in California as the Rice King. The forced relocation and imprisonment of Japanese Americans during World War II resulted in the loss of the family's land, processing plant, equipment, and homes. Nevertheless, they persevered, rebuilding and expanding the product lines after the war. Approaching its centennial, Koda Farms maintains a robust legacy of commitment to high quality food production. And we also have Mai Nguyen, pronouns they, them, is an independent farm owner, operator, and social justice activist. They grow heirloom grain in Sonoma County, cooperative economics in the food system, and racially equitable farm policy in California. Mai is also currently co-director of Minnow, an organization focused on securing land tenure for farmers of color and indigenous people. Mai has been featured in CNN, San Francisco Chronicle, Vice, Eater, and Patagonia. Okay, so thank you so much, Mai and Robin. Now that we got that out of the way, you know, this is going to be just a conversation. I think you both are just amazing. So let's get into it. Okay, so we are going to talk about rice, but really I expanded the conversation to talk about rice and grains in general, and also kind of just debunk the idea that, you know, Asian Americans, all we like our only connection is rice, or that rice is prominent throughout all of Asian America, and it is kind of not. But some housekeeping: if you have questions or comments, or just love for Robert and Mai, please put them in the comments. We will have a Q&A set portion, so put them in there, and then we're going to be able to get to them. And before we, you know, today we're going to we're talking about we're going to start with talking about California's rice growing history, specifically the history of Koda farms in the Central Valley. And it's such an interesting history. I'm so very glad to have Robin here with us. But before we get into rice growing in California, it's important to acknowledge that the history of rice in America isn't exclusive to Asian American farmers. This country's immense wealth was built on enslaved Black labor, and a lot of that labor was performed on rice plantations. And before that, indigenous peoples harvested wild rice. If you're more interested about the history and culture of rice in the South specifically, an excellent resource is, and recipe, and a collection of recipes is Michael Tweedy's rice book. It's really great. It's got a little kind of like rice culture-ish portion, and it's got really lovely recipes. It's really great. Okay, so if you're not familiar with Koda farm, excuse me, again, it's the oldest family-owned and operated rice farm and mill in California, and the rice of choice for many discerning consumers and chefs throughout the country. So Robin, let's start. Can you talk a little bit about Koda's history, how it started, maybe perhaps, you know, the challenges of establishing the farm in the first years?
Well, my grandfather, Robin Koda, immigrated to California in 1908 and had come from a background in Japan, Fukushima Prefecture, of rice farming and rice brokerage. So it was something that he had some familiarity with. When he came to California, though, he wasn't necessarily looking to go straight into farming. He tried different ventures, but eventually, by the late 1910s, was up in Northern California looking at rice and starting to manage as employee of other farmers, rice growing, rice management. And the traditional stronghold of rice in California is, of course, all north of the Delta, all north of Sacramento. And that's where he started off working for the people. And then eventually when an opportunity to take ownership of land came up that was south of the Delta, which was not much rice to speak of was grown at all south of the Delta. But he ended up farming down here about the same latitude as Gilroy, Monterey, which is definitely south, Central California. And in the early 1920s, the Alien Land Law Exclusion Act was already in place. The Alien Act of 1913 was already in place. So to circumvent that, Asians could still buy land in the name of their American-born children. So in the early 20s, that's what he did. He bought a large contiguous tract from actually Henry Miller of the famous Miller Lux entity, if you're familiar with California farming, and started farming here in South Dos Palos, Merced County and Fresno County.
I'm kind of curious that you said that your grandpa wasn't a farmer before. Like, what do you have any stories about just like the challenges of that learning curve? You know, like was it because he had already been working in other farms, and so he's like, so that wasn't
well the paternal side of the family was actually of, it sounds like such a cliche, of the samurai class in Japan, but they married into a merchant family. So the Wise family was actually in rice milling and rice commerce. So her husband, or my great grandfather, picked that up through that marriage. So my father was not a firstborn son, and in Japan, if you were a firstborn son, you were just the spare, right? So he really didn't feel any obligation or ties to stick around in Japan. He was very adventurous, and he actually attained a university degree in his very early 20s and was a school principal in Japan before Wanderlust really sunk its hooks into him, and off he went to America. So when he came to America, he didn't necessarily want to go into farming because farming is no walk in the park, never has been. And he actually started off doing some other little projects. He wildcatted for oil in the Coalinga Hills. he was in partnership with some other Japanese Americans for a tuning processing plant down in the San Pedro area, which was, there were a lot of Japanese Americans down there in the fish cannery industry back then. And then after that business dissolved, he then used his portion of those sales to open up a vegetable processing and canning entity. And I don't remember exactly what the circumstances were for why he ended up dissolving that, but the bottom line is he dissolved that and came north to California to look at rice. Well, actually, I do know some of that because at that time the rice farmers, the rice farmers were making. I mean, it's all relative. Back then, they were being. It was very. If you were successful, it could be a very lucrative career. And so, since he had some familiarity with that field already, he decided to like go back to it.
I love that he had wanderlust and he wandered all the way back to the family business.
In a sense, I mean, like I said, when you're not if you're not a firstborn kid, a boy in Japan, you're essentially what was that cliche, heir and a spare. So he was just a spare. So off he went. He had other brothers, younger brothers too, and they all eventually immigrated to California as well. I mean, by the time he immigrated over in 1908, they were already like tightening immigration for Asians and Japanese Americans in particular, but he came in under the, I hate to use the word pretenses, but he came over to study education because at that time he was a school principal in Japan.
Yeah, that was the only route for immigration. I wanted to know, you said that, and I just, there was, before you, there was mostly rice farms north of the Delta. What does that mean? Is there a difference in growing, or was it less desirable land?
Yes, there is. I mean, it's just historically that's where the rice farm industry started, and I think we've had mentioned this in other conversations. I mean, California has this interesting history of growing back then and still to this day, predominantly japonica. So they were growing japonica to essentially, back in the late 1800s, help feed Chinese rail workers, which of course is ironic since the Chinese rail workers eat long grain, and japonica is always going to be a more starchy, medium to short, sticky rice. But again, that was obviously more economical to start trying growing rice in California rather than importing that rice from the Orient to feed those labor forces.
And so what does that mean if you go south of the Delta? Is it just because they're not resources, or is it like...
Well, I mean, Northern California was just agriculturally speaking developed first. And so the further south you went, the land was less arable. So where he ended up being settled here in South Los Angeles, the land is to this day still very alkaline. It's very heavy, which you call clay soil, which is, soil is broken into different classifications. Clay is one of the least desirable. I mean, ironically, has turned into a silver lining in this day and age where water is really a huge concern. So, we use an analogy, farming in a bathtub, the water tends to sit on top of the clay. So in that sense, it helped. But back then, that was, that still was not desirable land, but it was what was available to an Asian American.
So this is why I think it's so really interesting, is that despite having less desirable land, harder to cultivate, he became the rice king. Like I love that. And I know that I'd love to hear more about the innovations that he created during his time, to help get that moniker of Rice King.
Well, when he bought land from Henry Miller entity back in the early 20s, he was able to buy a tract of over 5,000 acres, which is considerable, and it was considerable back then. And he was able to do that because he had been just saving his money like a crazy little squirrel, right? So anyway, he really, I mean, he didn't want to be unsuccessful. So, I mean, he had big dreams, and he started off, you know, just like tackling it from the start. In terms of innovation, he did not want to be just merely a contract farmer to another entity that was going to then, you know, take the product, process it, package it, and then therefore reap most of the profit. So with that in mind, he wanted to control everything from seed to finished product. So that entailed designing and building his own processing plant and mill, and he ended up also trademarking his products, because back then you couldn't trademark seeds. You could, and so I mean, it was not possible back then. So he did the next best thing, which was to try to associate trademarks with his product. So by the late 30s and coming up to the early 40s, he was really seeing quite a bit of success. So by then, you know, by around that time, people started referring to the Koda family and to him specifically as the Rice King.
I mean, I think
One of the things that he helped pioneer was sowing rice seed by air. So in Japan, when you look at rice fields and paddies, it's all done with little mechanized machines, and they're planting seedlings and everything. But when he came to America, you know, obviously the scale of farming was very different, and it just was not feasible to hand sow acres and acres of land. So concurrently in the South of America, you know, American South, like Arkansas, Texas, blah, 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 they were also concurrently doing the same thing, which was to sow seed by air. And when you sow seed by air, you're able to very efficiently cover larger tracts of land. So that was one of his other little claims to fame.
I love it. I love it. It's like so inventive. And I wanted to ask, because so he started out with 5,000 acres, and
He started off well. It's a little over that, but we don't like to talk about actual numbers. I always tell people, I don't ask you what's in your wallet, so don't ask me what's in mine. So yeah, it was somewhat north of 5,000, but yeah, the World War II wiped that out. I mean, so
yeah.
he owned, and he also rented additional acreage.
So
in production,
that's what I wanted to get to.
Sorry?
That's what I want to get to. Like, how much land you had before the war, and how much land were you able to come back to?
Yeah, well, I can just tell you that by the outbreak of World War II, they were working something like close to 10,000 acres.
And then when you came back, you know, this is like the injustice, you know, what?
Right. So when Executive Order 9066 came out, coming up to that, they knew nothing good was going to come of that situation. So he wanted to shut down the business to hopefully keep it intact. But the government actually caught wind of that and then mandated to them specifically to keep the business open and running, which of course is like ludicrous, impossible, impractical, and very transparently wrong to like insist that they do that from a relocation several states away. So yes, my grandfather was forced to sign over power of attorney to non-Asians to manage the farm, and then they were shipped off to Colorado. When they came back, they literally the day that they were released from Amachi, they drove straight back to the farm without stopping, and they knew bad things had been going on, but the extent hadn't been made entirely clear to them, with probably good reason. And when they got back, 90% of their land had been sold, their homes had been sold, the processing plant, all the best equipment, airplanes, livestock, everything was just gone. So my grandfather, who was obviously extremely tenacious, literally set up camp half a mile down the road and dug in his heels, and with the little bit of acreage they still had ownership with, they started to set up shop, build a new mill, try to find more land to buy. It's interesting because during the internment, the land that had been sold off for, at fire sale prices, most of it was sold to his neighbors, and those neighbors never came back and said, like, we feel bad about this. So the farm ended up being a crazy kind of like patchwork quilt of acreage here, there, wherever they could like find something that was available, which is not what my grandfather wanted, because prior to the internment, having a contiguous plot of land meant that your transportation and dragging around your heavy equipment and everything was more efficient. When your land is spread out nilly-willy, then that's not efficient.
When before internment, did you have Japanese American farmer neighbors? And when you came back, were they, like?
I don't know that. I don't know of neighbors who are actually, who are farming. I mean, maybe north of us, like say, if you're going up to like Turlock, where there were a lot of Japanese Americans who farm, specialized like in yams and some root vegetables. But in our specific area, my grandfather had a lot of Japanese Americans who worked for him, and their families were housed, and those were also those houses that were, liquidated during the internment. After the war, a lot of these families then, because the farm was starting over from scratch again, they couldn't support everybody. So a lot of these people then left the area.
So, so I'm like trying to think, like, how old was your father? Because your father took over the farm after your grandfather. Like, how old was he when this was happening? What was like, what were the things, his generation, what were the things the innovations he created to kind of keep the farm going and expanding the farm?
Well, the irony is that my father was the heir spare again. So he had an elder brother who would be like, I can't believe my grandfather did this. My grandfather groomed the eldest son to take over the farm, and my father, who was the second born son, was left to goof off at UC Berkeley, and he was at UC Berkeley when the internment hit, so his studies were interrupted. He never went back to UC Berkeley to finish a degree in mining engineering, because they were going to ship him down to South America to mine for gold. But they did have they had a coffee plantation down in Brazil. So that was another thing that sort of got lost not lost, but they lost, it sort of like gave that up to concentrate on rice farming. But so my father, whose original intent was not to come back to the farm, actually came back to the farm because of the internment. So he had an elder brother named William. So after the war, the farm became the entity known as Bill and Ed Koda. My grandfather gave all of his children Americanized names to part of the assimilation. And the two brothers then were essentially assigned the nuts and bolts rebuilding of the business.
So, I mean, that's just like, this is why this rice is so precious, that it has survived. And so Robin, I see a theme of like this, every person who is part of the farm, every generation was not really slated to be a farmer.
I know
you, Robin, went to art school. right? So did
You
you
bet.
did you want to be a farmer, or what did, well, you know, growing up, you know, what were your aspirations, and what brought you back to farming, or, you know, like The Godfather, how did they draw you back in?
Well, we are just like freaking like walking cliches, right? The guys are expected to take over businesses, and girls are supposed to like go off and like, you know, settle down. Well, I didn't do that. So
We love
my
that you
parents are like, hey, there's no free rides here. Get to work.
got it, got it.
Yep.
Um,
So that's where I am.
you know, in terms of like the innovations of the each different generations, like, you know, what were the changes that you and your brother, you know, enact in, you know, in your tenure with the, yeah, and stewardship of the farm?
Well, I'm going to backtrack then, because I mean, part of the innovations that my father's generation saw through were the introduction of our mainstay, our basically our what we consider our claim to fame, our medium grain table rice cocoa bros, and also they introduced their sweet rice, a short glutinous rice, and that again was another first for America. The sweet rice was a first for America, and concurrently they introduced the sweet rice flour that they milled from the broken kernels. So all of our mainstay products were conceived of with that generation. My grandfather spearheaded those projects because he wanted to have proprietary strains, but the sons were left to like actually do the nuts and bolts. My grandfather was the dreamer, the big plan, the big picture guy, and then people executed, well, his sons executed those dreams.
So your father's
My brother
generation,
and I do, yeah. So what do we do? Oh boy, I really don't feel like I'm doing much. Really, I'm riding on the coattails of my predecessors, and I am very grateful. My
well,
brother
I know that there's
decided
an
that he
organic
wanted.
line that started.
Yes, that's true. I'm getting there. Just gotta do the kowtow. Gotta do the kowtow thing, you know. I'm Asian. So anyway, my brother wanted to go back into organic farming because it was literally full circle. My grandfather, in my grandfather's day and age, it was all organic. Everyone farmed organic, right? And then with the advent of modernity, became there, you know, synthetic inputs became available to make rice grow more efficiently. So anyway, back in the late 90s, my brother proposed that we start doing organic farming again. And my father, who had a personal dislike for brown rice, and that's what he associated with organic farming, was not crazy about the notion at all. But anyway, my brother pushed that program through, and in 2004, I think it was, we had our first certified organic crop of rice. So we've been trying to grow that market segment. It's hard. The organic section is very competitive, and there is a 900-pound gorilla in the room that dominates the organic rice sector, but I won't name any names. Not us. Anyway, so
Well, thank you so much. I want to come back to you later, but I do want to give some time to Mai as well. But thanks.
yes.
I love this history. But you know, actually, it's segue between is like you don't grow just rice. You also grow garbanzos and barley. So tell me more about those grains, and then we'll segue into more
Sure.
grains.
So those are part of our organic program, and they're what we refer to as rotation crops. The barley and the garbanzos add organic matter back to the ground, make the till easier. The chickpeas add nitrogen back to the ground. In organic rice farming in California in general, rice goes into the ground every other year. That's typical for, say, like Northern California. In our practice, we do not plant rice on the same ground. We plant rice on the same ground every 3 years, and that is to let the ground rest, to increase the organic matter input, and that's how we farm. So
Great. Well, I wanted to make sure that question, because then that question is great segue into about, so when we talk about Asian American, there's this I feel an overemphasis on rice. So, I wanted to bring Mai in to talk about other grains as well. Mai, you're an advocate for small farms as well as other grains that are drought resistant. Tell me, how did you come to farming? Were your family farmers? What sparked that interest if it wasn't in the womb?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and for having me, and for letting me hang out with you and Robin. That's really why I'm here anyways. Yeah, for getting into farming, I was very focused on refugee resettlement. My family came as refugees, and I was interested in what it actually takes for refugees to establish a life and a home in a completely new place. And so while working at a refugee resettlement agency in San Diego, where I grew up, and in the community that I grew up in, I was running this farmers market and seeing how just incredibly popular the Southeast Asian produce stall was. Just like people would line up 2 to 3 hours before market opened. This is a morning market to like make sure that they got their greens, things that they couldn't find in grocery stores, not because it's an area that is devoid of grocery stores that carry culturally relevant crops, but just because of the rarity of the types of crops, just like the sweet potato greens that you just have to eat 3 hours after it's harvested, which I guess was right about the time that people got in line. Anyway, so that the desire for that food and the enthusiasm too to support local farmers really got me excited about wanting to grow these traditional crops, and inspired me to kind of reflect on my own childhood of our family. My parents worked a lot. I didn't see them very much, but we always sat down for dinner together, and having food that was comfort food and was uncomplicated in an otherwise complicated life was just essential for us to have a kind of peace while also having this connection to home and tradition and heritage, especially when we had these ceremonies that really center on specific kinds of food that you know really well in terms of starting the Banh Chung Collective. So yeah, I really wanted to contribute to growing that kind of food, and also growing it from the perspective of, one, is not using the chemicals that are typically used for vegetable production that were largely produced to drop on us and to destroy our forests and people. And then additionally, bringing my experience of having been a climate researcher and also a social justice activist and that framework into farming. So that's really informed how I farm, which is on the sort of agronomic side, and thinking about climate change is, how do we have all of the nutrients be developed on site through rotations, similar to what Robin had said, right? And integrating animals, or dry farming, given our drought conditions. How do we rely on less pumping of water, but actually on what rainfall provides us? And then on the, addressing social inequality, just trying to hit the major problems of our time. In the US, so much of social inequality, racial wealth gap is connected to a farming history and farming reality. And so how can farming be done such that people are paid a living wage, have healthy working conditions, and that the food that gets out to people is healthful, affordable, physically accessible? So all of those have really informed why I continue to farm.
When you started farming, were you simply focused on grains then too? Or what was, what was the decision to now, which is drought resistant strains of grains?
Yeah, I really didn't set out thinking that I was going to be where I am, which, I set out to grow like Vietnamese vegetables. I thought I was going to be growing like cà pháo, tito, like moop, stuff that I grew up eating. But then in thinking about a holistic farm system and having a local diet so that we can reduce our food miles, I thought about, well, like I want to grow all the things that we eat. And a lot of what we eat is grain. That's like the base of the food pyramid. And also recognizing like, I don't want to cherry pick my childhood diet, but I definitely also ate a lot of Pop-Tarts and Tombstone pizza, that's made from wheat. And thinking about the role of grains in a rotational system on a farm, and like, again, what grains to grow that is a balance of, what people are familiar with and eat, and also given our climate conditions and climate trajectory. So again, I had been a climate researcher, made climate models, and looked really bad and very dry. So I really was considering how to integrate the staple crops into my farm system. And eventually, through some unfortunate accidents where I couldn't farm full-time doing vegetables anymore, really relied on grains, which have a long growing period and sort of time where you're watching the grass grow. And in focusing on that, though, it's such a massive world. I think that like Robin kind of touched on in terms of her grandfather's history of just like what it takes to actually try to build up something that is radically different than what the rest of the industry is doing, right? From seed saving and selection all the way through processing and milling. And that's where I'm at and trying to do that for these drought resistant heirloom varieties of wheat, rye, barley that can that is a climate adaptation and also meant to be eaten as whole grains. And there's that whole kind of world and talking about what we've been industrially sort of imposed, what has industrially been imposed upon us, and sort of like what actually makes sense for having a full set of our nutrients available to us. So yeah, in trying to develop all of that, I think that's how I've, similar maybe to Robin's grandfather, people call me the grain queen, so I may be the grain queen.
I love the royalty we have here. So yeah, I would love actually for you to talk a little bit about your work in helping co-ops, and also I'm not sure if it's farm transitioning into co-ops or just food farm co-ops in general, and also the policy work you've been doing, and advocacy work you've been doing on the policy level.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks for those questions. Especially with, I think right now in our national landscape, as workers are reconsidering the structures that they're working in, and who owns what, and recognizing that there are these billionaires who've made a lot of money at a time when there are a lot of people who've become increasingly poor. What's the role of our work and its ownership and in the agricultural world? So I supported and continue to support agricultural cooperatives. That's where producers, so different farms, come together to then meet common needs, such as aggregating their products, sharing cold storage, doing marketing together, things that are costly for any individual farm to do, but has this benefit through collective efforts, right? And that's connected to our deep agricultural histories, particularly for farmers of color in the US, right, who have been marginalized from the sort of status quo systems and then have had to create their own. So there's that, and I've particularly focused on immigrant-owned farms and ones in rural areas where there's issues of resources in the relevant languages, but also access to capital and formal resources that are pretty racist in terms of gatekeeping. And then I've also worked on worker cooperatives, which means that the workers of the farm own the farm business, and they are equals in democratic decision making in that governance of the farm. And this, I think, has very significant radical implications in farming, given that farming has for so long in the US been about a stratification of a owner and the workers, and that extends to enslavement and this deep history that continues of an exploitation of workers. So for farm workers to be able to own the farm business, for people to have that agency over their conditions, for people who also know the land to also make decisions about the farm business and how it's run, and is a model that has major implications also in terms of how we might combat climate change and also work with the land in a more respectful way. So, yeah, without the work with cooperatives, and I think that world was connected to kind of my background in direct action and kind of like anarchist activism. It spoke to that. And then the 2016 federal election happened, and I just saw how really policies are this larger container that I've long ignored and knew that it had effects on me, but it really brought home the ways in which official policies, but also just the like symbolic gestures, and also what people, our electeds, were representing, had immediate impacts on farmers of color, rural America, and so that's when I became interested in policy advocacy.
Which I think is really great. And I also, what I really love about, if you don't follow Mai on IG, you should follow Farmer Mai, because I just love both your and Robin's like transparency, in terms of like, you talked about, crop failure, and it's just like I think both of what you both do is make a commodity product that in some ways is supposed to be invisible. Like the labor behind it is supposed to be invisible, it's supposed to be cheap, it's supposed to, you're supposed to have it all the time, and like, and then really showing like this costs a lot to get to you, and how you should value it. And so I really appreciate both of your work in that. I want to have saved some time for Q&A. So let's go to the Q&A before I like run out of time listening. I could listen to you all evening, but Tweedy, you want to come back on and do some Q&A, and if you want share some love too, we're happy to read those out as well. Tweedy?
Yep. Hi, here I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So we actually got a few questions about this. Where do you source heirloom seeds, and how do you source the correct sticky rice variety or the right wheat berry variety? And for Mai, how do you connect wheat to your own culture? Huge fan, says this person.
So, sourcing heirloom seed. We do not source heirloom seed. We maintain our own seed programs, and actually Cookbook, as well as the trademark, it's also associated with a specific strain of rice. And that strain of rice was created on our farm in the 1950s over the period of a decade. At that time, we hired the preeminent rice breeder in the US. His name was Hughes Williams. He was an unusual dude, being Caucasian, and even though there was still a lot of anti-Asian sentiment, Hughes Williams was willing to come and work for us for a decade to then create a strain that was proprietary and that thrives specifically for our soil type and climate, microclimate here in South Dos Palos. So that strain of rice known as Cocoa Rose is now something that we've maintained intact since the 1950s, late 1950s. And Cocoa Rose was introduced to the market commercially formally in 1963, I think. And so we maintain our own seed program, meaning we have our own seed nurseries and we grow our own seed. So we do not bring in any outside seed to grow Cocoa Rose. As far as the sweet rice, what we Japanese we call mochi rice or sticky rice, sweet rice, that started off more as, I mean, for that time it was a modern strain of rice, meaning that all the the rice that we grew in the 1950s were considered modern for that time, meaning they were fast maturing, high yielding. But today, by those standards, they are now considered heirloom because by today's standards, they aren't fast maturing. By today's standards, they're slow maturing, low yielding, and not economically feasible to grow. We grow our strains of rice as a labor of love. There's not really, I'm not going to retire to Tahiti or anything for sure.
Well, maybe we could try to have that goal together, Robin. I'll say what we can. See you in Tahiti in a few years. Decades maybe. But yeah, for my seeds, so yeah, at this stage, I save seeds year after year. Originally, a lot of the seeds that are now of the varieties that are grown to sell, because I still have a lot of trials, most of them were from a whole grain connection. There's this biochemist, Monica Spiller, who's been this really strong advocate for whole grains and for decades, and she had requested USDA germplasm seeds. You get like 25 seeds, and she worked with different Northern California farmers to trial them, and then over the years they were scaled up, and so I've been the beneficiary, this sort of second generation, to grow them out. So those varieties include Sonora, Chidon Blanc de Mars with Wolkering, and then there are other varieties that I grow that have come from refugees. So in connection to my refugee resettlement work, and keeping in touch with colleagues, and them knowing that I've been farming, when refugees have come from Syria, Afghanistan, and they've brought wheat seeds with them, I've been connected with them and have been growing out these seeds. So yeah, growing them out, saving, but to give you a ballpark of how long it takes for about like a teaspoon of seeds, which is what I've received. It takes about 10 years to get it to a point where you can maybe make a loaf of bread. So it takes time. And that assumes that they survived the wildfires and drought and floods.
Awesome. So Lori Czar here had a comment for both of you. Thank you both for your hard work. Your grains are the two staples in our household, and we are part of Mai's Grain Share for the second year. That's great. Michael Chang had a great question here. With the more recent wave of violence against Asian Americans, have either of you had to change the way you operate, or have you seen any impact to your businesses?
Oddly enough, we haven't. And part of it is that maybe it's just where we're located, and we are in a very out of the way place in the Central Valley, in the San Joaquin Valley of California. So we're sort of insulated, I think, from a lot of that in the more urban areas.
Yeah, I think, look, I'm chair of the Asian American Farmers Alliance. And so while I haven't been, like my farm hasn't been impacted per se, also I grow wheat, which in the context of the pandemic and everything has like a there's a high demand for it that has sort of, I think, buffered me, but not that both can't happen at the same time. But being chair of the Asian American Farmers Alliance means that I am in touch with a national network of Asian American farmers who are experiencing Asian American acts of antagonisms to violence to vandalism. And so there is a range, and I think I wish I wasn't such a sensitive person, but I am. So when I hear these stories, I really do feel for people. And so it is a weight, and also it's holding the spaces and cultivating the spaces to continue to keep people together and keep up morale, and as well as being connected to actions of solidarity, not just with other Asian American groups, but given the broader, we live in a racist society, and so in solidarity with other, anti-racist actions, that it's been heavy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I actually think that that's a great segue into this next question from Alice, and it's actually directed to Mai. But Robin, feel free to share if you have any thoughts as well. Do you have any advice for newcomers in agriculture interested in growing Asian American crops and getting involved with food justice? Any advice?
Don't do it. Sorry.
Robin?
Ooh, you took the words right out of my mouth.
It's funny because I met Robin in 2013 at the Heirloom Expo, and I was like, oh my god, an Asian American farmer. And it was really a unicorn situation. And then I was like, Robin, do you have any advice? And she was like, why are you doing this? Here we are years later. Advice. Robin, do you have any updated advice?
I don't, and I'm looking forward to retirement.
Be the spare, not the heir. That's how you get land.
That was really impractical. I'm sorry. Farming is just so tough in literally our country's climate, and California in particular. California is super regulated, and it's not to say that we're all out trying to do bad stuff, but I mean, it is really a difficult business climate to operate in. We have offered, which is unusual in agribusiness, we have provided health insurance for our employees since the 1970s. And back in the 1970s, offering your employees, your farm workers, health insurance was unheard of. But we wanted it, and we felt that our employees should have it as well. But today, health insurance is just a crazy expense. It is just almost, I don't know. The economics of it is very painful. And farming in California, that's just one little facet of it. I mean, farming in California is super regulated, and it's super tough, and everything here is very expensive. I can see why a lot of farm entities pack up and leave California.
Yeah, and I think that, it's really hard for me to jump into answering this question in a way that isn't just to say, don't do it. Because naming those realities, so much of farming is actually not doing the farming, or that might be a lot of your time is actually being out in the field. At the same time, a lot of what you're thinking about is your business plan, the finances, the regulations, and these other contexts. So I think for someone who is interested in getting into it, I think really the question is, where do you want to be in the long run? Because it's a real commitment. For grains, each year I only have one try. Rice, we only get one try each year. That means over your life you might get 40 tries. Does that sound like a thing that you want to commit to? Because the yields from it, the results from your efforts are going to be, few and far between. And so what is your health insurance, your health conditions, your social safety net, and who are you connected to and accountable to in the long run that you want to be able to support? You know, are there elders? Do you want to have a family? And so how does like a farm and its realities connect to your overall life plans? Because farming is a whole life.
Absolutely. So I think we have time for one more questions. And I thought this was a nice question to end on. And I'm going to throw it back to Diep after this. Your moderation has been wonderful, Diep. And if you wanted to close us out with anything. But here's the question for both our speakers. Do you feel a spiritual connection to farming and your ancestors?
Big time, big time. Yes, yes, that's exactly why I'm here. I mean, I've described my being here, my brothers involved in this business as it's the legacy of the heart. It doesn't make sense economically. I mean, I see, I mean, just to be a realist, I mean, I think that rice has a finite future in California. I mean, thank God. I mean, I feel bad enough growing rice with the water situation, but hell, at least I'm not growing lawn.
In the hierarchies of farming, at least you're not growing lawn. A spiritual connection, yes. And I think in relation to Lori's question too, like this connection to farming sort of helps me get through these tougher times, right? Is that when I started growing Vietnamese crops, the seeds came from Vietnamese people who escaped by boat and have entrusted me with these seeds. And so I feel a connection to that sense of hope that they brought with them. And it helps me also think about the generations of seeds that came before the ones that have come into my hands. And I think that, you know, by taking pause to examine seeds and to think about what goes into making them so, that it is these human hands, but also the soil, the water, the supernovae that exploded to get them to these points to be matter in our hands is very spiritual and very grounding, and helps me think also about my role in a continuum of seed savers that is also one that is hopeful, looking to the future of those who might be holding the future iterations of these seeds.
Actually, I think that's great to end. I really want to thank Mai and Robin for your time. And I know that, you know, Robin, I know that it might be difficult because you do, like, when it, especially, you know, Asian Americans who are, you know, either in farming or in food or care about farming, like when they see you, you know, it's like we don't want to foist on you all this meaning, you know, but it does mean a lot to us. I'm not Japanese American, but to know the story, to like, you know, feel indignant for you, all that stuff, like, you know, like, I'm so glad that the farm exists, the farm continues to exist, and, you know, and so just really thanking you for, you know, doing the work. And it's not always glamorous work, you know, and you're always so just like so generous with your time, coming down to the market, you know, just all that stuff. Like, it means a lot to the Asian American community. I mean, I think it means a lot to anybody who cares about farming. And I've said this before, I'm a former chef, because are you a chef? You don't have a restaurant anymore. But like, even when I was a chef, I felt like chefs get way too much play, you know, because really, where are you going to be without the farmers? But, you know, the farmers always get the short shaft, you know, like, so, you know, I really want to thank you both for just shining a light on just the Herculean tasks that are involved in farming. And I want you to also know that you have a lot of love in the community. Like, your subscription is like coveted, and people are like, we gotta get on it, you know. And like when I, you know, and when like people you know, who like, oh, there's a cheaper sweet rice for Banh Chung, I'm like, I don't think so. You know, so, you know, for me, like, it means a lot that you're both producing what you're producing. And And I know it takes a lot out of you, not just financially, but your soul. You know what I mean? You put a lot into it. So thank you so much for your time. Yeah. Anyway, I'm just gushing now. So, but shall we end with the gushing?
Thank you, Dee.
All right. So thanks again for everybody who tuned in. We appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Thank you for attending, and please check out each of our websites to see what's upcoming. Great programming. And thank you, Robin, Mai, and Diep. Oh, we have a young farmer.
No, I got a wish.